Now we're going to go to the next step. We're going to build a jig for the roof. Now this is a jig I built for another building, just to illustrate where the parts go. We have a piece that goes across the bottom. Notice I always label these clearly so that I know what the scale is that I'm working with, and how wide the structure itself was. So this one that we're doing now, I'm labeling this one, as you can see, Video PVD 3 1/4" scale, 12 feet wide. Okay, now that's just plain styrene. That's styrene that's about 60 thousandths thick, so it's pretty stiff. And I've got some other styrene pieces there that I use to glue on to hold the different pieces in place as we assemble the jigs for the roof. It's very important that these be very accurate. You know, we want them all to be the same, or else the roof pieces aren't going to line up. So I take that drawing, another copy of that original drawing that has the outline of the building and everything, and again, I just cut around it. And I cut fairly close to it this time. Now when I drew the lines for the roof, I drew those quite long. What we're going to do is we're actually just going to set this in place just like we did before. Okay, we're just going to set it down there. Actually going to tape it in place. Going to tape it so that we get a nice accurate drawing of this. We're going to remove this, but we do want to tape it. Notice where I'm taping it. Okay. Now we've got that in place. What we're going to do next is we're going to figure out how these pieces go and everything, and we want to extend these lines onto the plastic. Okay. So I've lined up my ruler there. Let me change it around so you can see what I'm doing. I put the mark over on the plastic and down on the plastic, not on the paper. These are marks that are on the plastic itself, the white styrene. Okay? And those show those lines that we use for the roof. Okay? Now we're going to draw one right square right where the top of this goes, and then we're going to extend each side up so that we can see exactly where the sides of this building would be. Okay, so just be patient with me here and you'll see what we're doing here. Now again, the marks I'm putting here are not on the paper, but the marks are on this white styrene. Okay, now I also want to mark that center line. That's very important, that center line, because that's going to work with our roof. Okay. Now what I can do is I can take that tape off, peel our piece off, and you see I've got the marks there. I've got our marks for the important parts of the structure outline are there. So I'm going to use my ruler again, and I'm going to join those lines. Okay, line it up very carefully. You got to do this very carefully. Okay, and draw a line this way. That's for one roof. And here's for the other roof line. Get these just right. Okay. Then we draw across between our marks there at the top of the main floor of the building. That's at the ceiling line. And we draw that center line right down through the middle. Okay, working very carefully with that. Now we draw along the sides of the structure. First one side, then the other. And you can see what we've done is we've transferred the dimensions of our drawing that we had, that we ran through the scanner or the printer. We've transferred those dimensions so we have them there. And I also need the ones right down at the bottom. So you can see that overlaps. Just so. See how nicely that overlaps? And then I'm going to put marks down at the bottom for that. And everything, get everything to line up. You can use those marks to line everything up just right. And then I'm just going to, being very careful here to get it just so. And put the ruler back down there. Put a mark there and a mark there. Remove the paper, join those marks. And that gives us the outline of our front that we originally used. And it should be exactly the same as was on that piece of paper. See how easy that is to do? Okay, so it's a handy way to start with building this jig. Now I'm using some styrene here. The size isn't important. This is about 1/8 by 3/16 inches. And we just mark a place here and we score it. We're going to snap that. It snaps very easily. Now I use, you can see the size there, that it's about 1/8 by 3/16. And we're going to glue that in place. I'm going to glue that in place right there. Notice we don't go over beyond the edges of the building. Okay, the original building line. Use some liquid cement. And I recommend that you, when you glue this one piece in, that you let it set long enough for the glue to really set up. I just use Tester's plastic cement. Works well for this. The styrene is Evergreen brand styrene. Now on the styrene there's a shiny side and then there's a flat side. And that flat side, the dull side, takes the marks much better. Okay, so let that dry. Now here I see this is 1/16 by 3/16 inches wood, and this is going to be used for the rafters. Okay, and we're going to put those rafters right there. They're going to line up above that roof line there. So we want to glue right to that roof line. Now this little piece we're putting here is going to hold one of the rafters in place. So we line it up carefully right up against that line, and then we apply some cement. Let that dry. Now again, I recommend you take the time to really let these dry, each one, so that you don't accidentally bump into them and knock them around. And you can tell by the size there. So you have to make sure there's room for the beams to go across there. You can't have these come right down next to that long piece. There has to be room for that piece. So you can bring it right down pretty close to that. There also has to be room up at the very peak of the roof with these. So we get that one lined up just right, and we add a little bit of glue to it. What I also do after I glue these in place and after they're tacked into place, I come back later and wash the area around them pretty good with more styrene cement in order to make it glue even better. Okay, now here you can see that rafter is going to fit right up against there like that. So we need to hold that rafter in place. Now this is a piece you put right up against that. Now my experience is it doesn't work well to just push it flush up against there. Makes it too hard to get them out. So what I do is I take a strip of paper, okay, and I put it between the wood and this piece that I'm pushing up against there. See how that piece of paper holds that wood? So there's a little bit of a gap there. I put the paper on the far side of the wood, but it's between it and that first block we put in. And I put this bit in, take the paper out. It's just ordinary, some of the scrap that I cut away with from the graph paper. And we do the same thing on the other side. Put that piece of paper in, push the wood up against it, slide your piece of plastic that you're using for your jig up against it, hold it in place. Got to do this all very carefully. Got to leave room over there where I just pointed out for that cross member to come through too. You know, after you've made one or two of these jigs, it becomes second nature to make them. I've made jigs like this for 25 years and I save them all, and it's really helpful the next time you go to build a building that's going to use the same dimension. You can use this jig. This particular building that we're using here can be used for so many different things. It's got nice lines. You can use it for a garage for a car. You can use it as a little repair shop, as a blacksmith shop. You can use it as a commercial structure, a little building on the dock, or anything like that. Now this piece that I have right here, okay, there's going to be the ridge for the roof is going to come across through there. So this one gets glued. This is a piece of the wood itself that I'm holding up in that place, and I've got these little pieces that are going to be glued in there. Okay, so a little piece of plastic comes right up against that. Okay, so you put that little piece of plastic there. Get it just so. Hold it down. Put some glue on it. Let that dry. It's very important to let each stage of this bit of work, let all these dry. I don't show the drying time here in the video, but it's very important that you let it dry, because if you don't let it dry, you're going to end up with a big mess. Now here, got this little piece, fits right up against it. Now notice this time I've left the piece of wood in there. I put the glue there. Okay, there I move the piece of wood down, make sure it slides a little tiny bit. Now after this is all dried, make sure your plastic glue is all dried. Then I put a drop of Elmer's right in there between the plastic. I'm going to take that piece of wood and I'm going to glue that piece of wood in, and it becomes part of the jig. Okay, again, this is the same size as the beams for the rafters. Okay, so that glues right in there. Notice I had it extends a little bit below the peak. Okay, so that's what our jig is going to look like. Really simple, really easy to use. Now on our structure here, we need to add one more piece of wood up at the very top. Now that piece of wood at the very top is a 2x4. Same height as that top plate that we have there. Now this extra part that goes on top is called a cap plate. The reason we didn't build it as the part of the wall is because it's not exactly the same length of the wall. But it's on that cap plate where our roof trusses are actually going to rest. So we're going to start by marking a piece of wood, and we're going to make this piece of wood exactly the same width as our structure. And that's the part that's actually going to rest right on the structure itself. And then we're going to cut the portions for the rafters themselves. Okay, so I'm going to get my handy cutting device here. I wish you could get one of these easily, but this is a custom-made tool. It's very handy. There is a version of this I've seen available at the narrow gauge conventions. Now here we're going to make a cut on the rafter. Okay, and that cut we make there, that's called the ridge cut. That actually goes right up against the ridge board. Now that ridge board, that little piece of wood we had on the jig represents the width of the ridge board. So we've cut one rafter there, and we've got this other rafter here that we're putting into position. Then we're going to lay that piece across the bottom. That piece across the bottom is the part that lays right on the framework. And then a little piece at the top to tie it all together. Okay, so there's our 4 pieces of wood we're going to use for each of our rafters. All we have to do is glue these in position. Now it's very important when we glue these that we don't get any glue on the plastic or it won't come out. So we're only using gluing it in 4 points. One is where that small piece at the top holds it together. Okay? Then we're also going to put glue on this large piece at the bottom to hold it together. Okay? That goes on just like that. See how that works? Very easy, very straightforward. But actually, there's a little more to it than that. Since we had that cap, that extra cap go on the side walls, we need to make a little bit of room for it here. But that's what a finished piece will look like. Okay? When it's all dry, that's what our pieces are going to look like, just like that. And they're going to rest right down against our building, just like that. Okay? Very interesting. I'm going to build a whole bunch of them that go right across there, just like that. I want to make sure that it lines up and rests right against that part there. That's the critical points. We don't want it to be wider than that. We don't want it to be narrower than that. We want to be just right. Now, I recommend the purchase of a book on house framing. This is a book that I bought at Lowe's on framing. The particular book is House Framing, is by John D. Wagner. And they show right here this little point that I'm pointing at, that little part that I'm pointing at there. That's called a bird's mouth cut. Bird's mouth cut. It's a little notch that's in the rafter that allows it to rest against that cap plate. If you don't have it resting against that cap plate, if you don't put a notch there, then it really weakens the roof, the rafter. All the weight is on an edge, and it just doesn't make for a sturdy building. So one thing we need to do is we also want to put that in on ours. So how do we do that? Well, it's very easily done. Now what I'm doing right here is I'm putting one piece of wood in. Okay? That one piece of wood is going to be the same as we had that cap plate on our side walls. So I have to compensate for that. And I have to compensate for that by putting that piece of wood in, and it just rests there. Okay? And when we actually build our trusses that we use for this building, we're going to build it just the width of that above. We built our jig. Now this is one thing we add to our jig, is we just glue that one piece of 2x4 material right there, and we let that dry. Okay? Now when we put our rafters in, there's our two rafters. We're still going to glue the little piece of wood right at the top. Okay, the rafters, very important that they go flush up against that. Now, no matter how careful you are, there's always going to be a little bit of disparity right there with that ridge board. But since all your pieces are going to be identical, it's going to work out fine. So we put a little bit of glue on that piece that we're holding the pieces together with up at the top, just like so. And then we're gluing this piece in at the bottom. But now, the first time I glued a piece there, I didn't have provision there for that little piece of wood there, for that cap plate. Now I do. See, that glues right up against that piece of wood that's part of the cap plate. Okay, see how that is? And that elevates it just that amount, and that will compensate for the cap plate on our side walls that we're going to be adding. You'll see how all this fits together. This is just a nice little touch I put in. You don't have to do it. I put it in so that my end walls and my side walls interlock just a little bit. Not quite like a jigsaw puzzle, but they do interlock just a little tiny bit, and it makes it much nicer. Works well for me. Okay, so that's how that's going to fit there on the back. But see, again, we're going to have that cap plate, so we're going to have a little gap there. See how it doesn't come right quite down to there? Well, it'll do fine once we put that cap plate in there. Now here's how you put those little notches in there that I spoke about. You just have to eyeball this. And you just line your razor blade up and put that little cut there. Again, now this kind of notch, looking at my book again to get the correct term, this is a bird's mouth cut. A bird's mouth cut. And that will allow that to just set right down even with the building. Do this on each side, just press straight down and then come up from the other side. And this, the width and size of this bird's mouth cut is not really critical. It just has to be enough so that when you go to put this board on there, it fits flush against it. See how that? There's a little bit of gap there, but that little bit of gap doesn't matter. You want that ridge board there, that board there, to set flush against the top of your structure. So that's how you get those little notches in there. Just one of those little things you just learn by experience, but here you'll be able to do it. So either way, it works fine. Okay, but see the notches there are a little big. That one on the right, you can see the notch is a little too big. But you don't have to have it just right. This allows the bulk of the rafter to set squarely on your vertical studs, and it makes it much stronger. So we're ready at this point to go ahead and glue that piece in. We just put a little bit of glue on there. Now this is the back part of the building that we're working with at this point. And we just glue that on just like that. And you'll notice when we do that, that the rafters are flush with the end of the building. Okay, you can see that this rafter jig piece that we built, that set of rafters could be installed this way, or it could be flipped over the other way. But this way, the rafter itself lines up right with the edge of the building. Okay. And we just want to make sure we got it lined up and centered just right. Okay. Very good. Now we want to put some supports in to support that. And I do that. There's lots of different ways you can do this. This is one of those things that at the time this structure was built, carpenter standards were not really what they are today. So each individual carpenter would have just done it differently. The reason we want to continue those studs up is when we lay our siding over this, we want something for our siding to rest against, to be nailed against. Of course, we're not nailing, we're gluing. So here you see I've got a little piece of 2x4 that I've cut notches in. Okay? And that allows that to slip under that rafter and over the bottom part there. See how that slid into place? That way we can put these pieces in. I've got another piece, going to do it on the other side. Same type of cuts. 2 notches. And that way it rests just right. You just have to fit these into place. There's just no good way to speed this up. So you cut 1 notch, then you just, I use my finger as a place to mark the other part, and you cut the other notch in. Push down all the way through, turn it, Cut the notch out. That gives you your wood, and it's ready to go in there. Each piece has to be fit into place. There's just no way to mass produce these. And you'll notice the one on the left is longer than the one on the right. That's not important. What we want to do is we want to make sure it lines up with those studs underneath. If you need to do a little bit of adjustment with it, just use an emery board. And there I filed that notch at an angle so that it would fit right against that upper part of the rafter. Very easy little thing to do. Doesn't take an awful lot of time, but adds to the overall appearance of our structure very nicely. See how that lines up? Okay, just gluing these pieces in, a little bit of glue, slide them back into place. We want to make sure that when we do this, we recognize that these 2x4s are positioned in such a way that the siding will lay flush against them. Again, I don't use a lot of glue on any of the joints in the structure, but a little bit of glue, and it makes the structure quite strong when it's actually done. Okay, very nicely done. Those line straight up. That's the important thing. You want them to line up as best as you can. Just always hard to get them perfect, but you want them to line up as best as you can. A little extra time spent at this point just makes for a better finished model when you're done. Okay, now we need to do them for the smaller areas too. Those smaller areas right above there, we want to put cut one and put it into place for that. Now what I'm doing here is I'm cutting this piece. This is going to be that piece that goes atop that cap plate. Now when I lined that up, I cut it not full to the length of that structure. See, it doesn't go all the way to the end. It goes almost all the way, but not quite. Okay, there's going to be a little notch there, and that little notch, it's going to be on both sides of this building. That's going to allow the cap plate that's on top of the walls to slip right in there so that the fronts and the backs sort of interlock together just a little bit. Okay, so that board goes over. Now the scale 2x4, in this case, since I'm actually using 1/8 by 1/16, that notch is 1/8 of an inch away, and then I just glue that piece on there for the ends. Okay. Okay. Line that up as carefully as I can. Then we let it dry. Now we want to work on our door area here. What we're going to do is we're going to cut the notch out just like we did on the front. We're going to be cutting a notch out here for the door. Pushing straight down, cutting at an angle rather than trying to cut all the way through. Just do this a little bit at a time so a very nice neat little thing, and our door casting fits right into place. You could scratch build a door frame if you wanted. Be very easy to do, but I like the convenience of having the castings from the door there. Now when I built that, I had failed to compensate for that little opening at the bottom. So that's for that little piece I just cut in. Now I actually get ready to glue this door frame into place. Again, for gluing the plastic to the wood, I find that Elmer's Works perfectly fine. A lot of people think you have to use epoxy, or they search for all kinds of other glues to glue plastic to wood. And I find that just using Elmer's works very well. Again, we don't want a lot of excess glue. Okay, so that just glues right into place, just like that. We want to make sure I'm taking that piece that I have there across the bottom, slide the door down so it rests right against that, because we want that part right at the bottom to be square. Well, now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and we're going to be adding our siding, just like we did on the sides of the building. It's now time to add our siding on the back part of the building. So again, we just glue these pieces. Now these can be cut to length. You can cut all these to length so that they're all the same. And my fingers are a little sticky right there. No matter how hard you try, it's always impossible to keep the glue off your fingers. Helps to take breaks every once in a while. Wash your hands. This glue comes off very easily. Just a little tiny bit of glue there. And just glue that next board right into place like that. Very straightforward, very easy to do. And here what I'm doing is I'm reaching over and I'm cutting this one so that instead of having all the boards be the full length that go across this area, I want some to go over a little bit, halfway over, a third of the way over, a fourth of the way over. I always want to make sure that my joints are always right over one of the 2x4s. That's how it would be in real life, and we want to make sure that we just take a moment and do that. Put it in at a little bit of an angle. What I've tried to do there, I've put it so it's just sagging, or when they actually nailed it on, they were a little sloppy in doing it. And we want to fit the other piece in, just like that. Cut another board. You don't want to use that same board that's laying there to finish it up. You want to have another piece of wood, but you can use the two pieces, the two small pieces that are left over, a little further up on the side. Okay. Adding some glue again. Anytime it doesn't fit just right, you can always dress it up with an emery board. Okay, just like that. And we just continue to work our way right up alongside that wall. Okay, so there we have the wall done, and you see I've brought it up. Now we're going to do this little area along the side, and you see those little small pieces that I have cut right there laying on my work area to the side. For this proceeds very quickly. We're going to actually, after we get this done, we're going to come back and we're going to lightly sand the sides of each of these, so this doesn't have to be exact, but here, instead of gluing each individual piece, I just put a piece on and just glue these little bits on the side. You want to be careful to make sure each one gets lined up and works out about the same as it does the section on the left, the main portion over there on the left-hand side. But this proceeds very quickly, just gluing these on just like this. Okay, we just continue our way up to the wall. Now when we get to the upper part here, we want these to, of course, to go over. But right along the edge here, we want to put a piece of material. And for that, I've cut that out of the same thing as I use for my 2x4s. This is a strip of wood. It's painted and stressed. And it's out of that 1/8 by 1/16 material, and it's cut to length. And I glue it right along the very edge. This is just a trim piece. I glue it right along there, and I want to actually cut it off at that point right there, so I don't put glue right at that end. But I glue this in. And notice I glue it so I leave room there at the top for that ridge board to protrude through. I put a larger piece of wood. This is a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch piece of wood that I use just to glue it right up against there. And I want to put the other one in place as well. I don't know how important this is to have this in real life, but it's something on the structures around my house that I see is there that are made from wood. So anytime I have a question about how something is actually built, I actually go out and take a look and see how it looks in areas around my house. So again, that's glued into place. Again, I want to move it down. I want to make sure that it fits right there. Now in this case, I did not leave room for that ridge board. That ridge board's going to fit nicely behind it. Okay, so we let that dry. So I actually glued it right up to the top. And we want to let this dry before we go ahead. Now notice there's a little area there. It gives me a little lip that I can glue my pieces on. Okay, now while that's setting up, we're going to go do a little bit more work on the front. Now here's the pieces we had originally had it set it done, but I hadn't left room for that cap plate to fit on there. So I want to cut a piece, fit in there. This is going to be my cap plate material. This is 2 foot by 4 material, the same as the cap plate on the side buildings. Okay, and I just cut it and I glue it into place there. Now this piece I had go right to the ends. It wouldn't work out very well to leave a little gap in there. So I glue that into place, and I glue the rest of our framework for the front of the building in here. I'll square it up here at the side. On both sides so that it's even. Okay? Very good. And I put my weight on there and let both those pieces glue. Now as that's setting up, let both those pieces dry. Now as that's setting up, I start to add my siding on the back again, and each piece has to be cut individually to fit here. So you just lay the piece of wood over, cut it at the correct angle. Have to cut each piece to fit here. Can't mass produce this. And I want the boards to continue on evenly across. Where I have joints, I want to have them right over those 2 upright studs that I have there in place. Okay, so add a little bit of glue there, right along the top of this board here. Those are the areas where it needs to be, along the edges, and there on those studs, those upright studs. So that piece is just going to fit into place just like so. And my other pieces are going to be all cut individually to fit accordingly. Okay, so this piece goes 2/3 of the way over. Fits in there just like that. And then we're going to need to cut a little piece to fit in that area there. Now what I did with that board when I ran it across, I did that just to pick up the little bit of glue that had squeezed out. Okay, so here we're going to cut it at the proper angle on the right hand side. Just lay it in place. Mark it with your knife like that. You can actually cut through all the way if you like. Lay that in place. Mark where it's going to go with your X-Acto knife. And then cut that piece. Once that piece is cut, put the glue in so it'll fit right in place there. A little bit along where it's going on the edge and a little bit there. And that piece is ready to glue into place as well. And we just continue right up along the side, working that way. Putting glue in, putting little bits here and there. And we just continue working right up, fitting these pieces in there. Anytime you get a glob like that, just sort of pick it up and get your pieces, fit them right into place, make sure they all fit well. If they don't fit well, make a new piece. That's always the secret on doing something like this. And you just continue this right on up until you get to the peak. Okay, well at this point here we just have that one little bit to add up there at the roof. You can see we've got a lot of color variation there on our boards, but they don't have a striped look like a zebra would have, but certainly a lot of variation in wear, the original paint and how it's held up and everything. This piece here, we just lay it in place, mark with a razor blade where we want to make the cut, mark it enough so that you can see it, and then put it down on your workbench and press on through to make that final cut there. I'm going to add a little bit of glue now, a little bit right along the edge there and on the edges of our piece. And when we get that done, we're all ready to press in that nice little finishing piece there. And that's pretty much going to finish up the siding there. All we have to do now is we have to do a little bit of trim work. Over on the right hand side, you can see that's pretty raggedy, so we'll want to sand carefully along there and along the left. Now the rafters that overhang we're going to leave, but that little trim bar we're going to take off. Now here we've let this dry thoroughly. And we're, once again, like we did with the walls, we're peeling off the paper from off the back. Want to be careful doing this. Work at it a little bit, but it's a pretty strong piece of wood, so you can, you're highly unlikely you're going to damage it. And just rip off all the major portions that you can get off. Get as much as you can off. Then for the balance of it, we need to do as we did before, is just sand it lightly against some coarse sandpaper. You don't have to worry about wearing down the wood. You're not going to wear down very much. And that gets rid of just about everything. If you find some really troublesome spots, you can just take the tip of your X-Acto knife and just scrape away those areas where there's anything left. Chunks of glue, things like that. We just want to make sure it all looks very nice and neat and get rid of any of the glue marks. It's certainly easier to do it this way than to try to find some soft surface to work on, put wax paper over your plan and hold it with T-pins and everything while it sets. Plus this way your joints are all very close together and very well done. See right here there's a little bit of excess glue and everything. It doesn't take long at all to hit it with the X-Acto knife and just scrape those things off. Very easily done. You could just use the sandpaper or an emery board here and just do a little extra detail on it as well. Sometimes you want to just pry off a piece or use the corner of the knife to carve it a bit, but just you can work on as much as you need to get rid of it. Now along here at this edge here, you can see it's very rough. And there's different ways of doing this. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try with a brand new sharp X-Acto knife to remove these things, but you're going to see what it really does is just sort of beat these things up more than anything else. Perhaps if I came from the other direction, it would have been better. But it just sort of chews it up here, but it at least gets it to where it's soft enough that you can sand along there. And that's what we really want to do, is we want to sand along there and make it nice and smooth. So I do that with an emery board. You can see how those different chunks have just come loose there. So I just sand along with the emery board until everything gets nice and smooth. And those pieces, well, you can just glue those other pieces back on there, or you can leave it like that and it just looks like it's really been weathered an awful lot. Little pieces like that would fall off very easily on a building. On the other side, it's very easy to just sand it down with your emery board. Doesn't take long at all to do that. Main thing you want to do is you want to make sure it's square. We're going to be adding a little trim piece here on the end, and we want to make sure that it fits flush. Very nice and smooth along there. And there's a little bit left over there, so I'm going to work on that a little bit more. Doesn't take an awful lot of time to do these things, but it's important to work on each step. You know, we've come a long way on this building so far. Now along here, we can see how this is going to fit. This is going to fit in here like this. Okay, it's always sort of fun when you first start framing up a building to see how it's going to look and everything. Now up here where I'm pointing at is I've got that extra strip that I put in there, so I'm trimming that off. Actually, that's the piece I need to peel off that I tacked on lightly. Okay, that allows that overhang. See that overhang there? And there's an overhang at the other end as well. Now on this end here, I'm going to sand this one down. This one, I'm going to sand off a little bit to make sure it's even. Then I'm going to peel that piece off. Pop that piece off. If it needs any cleanup in there, just clean it up a little bit like I had to do there. Just remove a little bit of that. That gives us an overhang that's exactly the same depth as one of our 2x4s. So when that joins, see how that now comes right and overhangs that 2x4 we had there on the end of the front. So now we just need a little trim piece right there on the side to finish it up. So we got that at both ends. Now this one was a little rough on that end, so I just wanted to square it up just a little bit before actually gluing it in place. Okay. Now along up here on the top, we're going to add one more piece of wood. This other piece of wood, for the term for this for builders, this is a cap plate. And we put this on, instead of as we build the wall, we put this on afterward because it actually extends over a little bit. It's not exactly the same length as the wall. It's a little longer. It's longer by the length of, in this case, a 1/16 of an inch. The size of that 2x4. And you'll see how this interlocks together here shortly. So we're just going to go ahead and glue this on here. You'll also notice here that I didn't bring my siding right up to the very top. This is one reason, is because I hadn't put this piece on here yet, but I actually like to put the siding on after that final part at the top after I get the walls assembled. Okay, so see, I've got that overhang there on the end. Okay, and of course we let that dry. And we do exactly the same thing to the other end. Now this time, instead of peeling the piece off first, I'm going to do the correct thing, which is to sand it even. And then I'll peel that piece off instead of doing it first. Okay, so here I'm just sanding it down, getting it nice and smooth. Just have to lift it and try it and make sure. It's easy to tell when you run over. You also want to make sure it's vertical. You don't want it leaning one way or the other. It takes a little practice to get it vertical, but you don't want to have it at an angle. If you get it at an angle, that little trim piece is never going to fit in there just right. Okay. Now that we've done that, we remove these little pieces that we tacked on at each end. That provides us with our overhang. And now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut and glue on another piece here on the top, just like we did on the other side. Again, making sure we have a little bit of overhang. You see, I'm cutting that so that it's even with the end of that siding material there, so that I do leave a gap there. Notice there is going to be a gap there. Now here's where that overhang fits in. See, that fits right down in there where I'm pointing at. That little top strip fits right into that notch that has been left there. See how it fits right there into that notch, just like that? Well, that helps lock it together, and the builders actually overlap that top 2x4 to do this in real life. So we just run some glue right along in here. Now here we put a little more glue than we normally do. We want to make sure we have a good solid joint here. We don't want to get messy with the glue, but we want to make sure we have a liberal amount there. I go through a lot of toothpicks, and as you can tell, my toothpicks are all different colors. I like them because they're easy to spot on my white surface. Okay, so there we got the glue in, and that just fits right in there like that. We'll of course want to take out that little bit of blob of glue we got there right at the end. Very easy to remove along through there. And just follow with the paintbrush. See how easy that paintbrush just picks that up? Makes that just disappear. So I keep a lot of brushes handy, and I clean them at the end of each session and leave them to dry, and they're handy for the next time. You can buy a packet of these little brushes, about 20 of them, for $1.50 at places like Walmart, so they're easy. Now it's important that this be square. Now any square piece that you have works well. My little wood cutting device, made out of plexiglass, the glue doesn't stick to it easily, so I use that. If you don't have that to square it up, you can use a CD cover. There's lots of different things around that are square. And then of course you want to set and let that dry thoroughly, and then after it dries we'll be adding the other piece. But we can't use that plexiglass piece because it's too big. So here I went down to the hobby shop and I just bought a piece of this is I'm not sure if this is Basswood. Yeah, this is Basswood Chunks. They just sell them in a little bag, and you get a variety of different ones. By trimming off right at the corner like I'm doing here, it makes it so that it won't glue this big chunk to your pieces when you add that second wall. So again, to glue all this together, we just we're going to put some more glue right there on the end of that again, the other piece. And it also is going to fit that notch. A little piece sticks out, it's going to fit into that notch. Just add our glue along. I'm going to get it some on that notch so it goes in there, but we don't want any extra slopping out. So after I put the glue on, I just drag it along like that to even it out. That evens out the glue. Just little tricks you pick up over the years of building things like this. Now I'm not a professional carpenter, Sometimes I don't follow all the rules exactly on carpentry, but you know, if my friend Bob the builder, when he comes over, he may look at it and find fault with the things that I do. But it's pretty close, and for the average person looking at your model, it'll look fine. So we've got that set up there. So again, we want to make sure that that sets up, dries thoroughly, but we got to make sure it's square. And the best way to make sure it's square is either to measure that part at the front, or what's really best is to actually get your piece that you're going to have there, that you're actually going to put there on the front. Now, since we knew our building was a certain width, it's very easy to measure to make sure they're the same. But I a lot of times like to put the other end into place. Now here you can see that we've switched back over. While the rest of that's setting up, we're back to working on the front of the building, and that's what we're going to be concentrating on now. So I'm just adding these pieces to build up the front of the building. As these are parts between that top plate and the very top of the false front there. I guess we would call these cripples. And you know, it's going to be awfully hard for people to see these particular parts. You can build this building so that your roof is removable. We'll cover that later so that it's removable if you want. There's really no extra work involved in it, making it removable. And my big finger's getting away. Should always use the tweezers, but I tend to stick my fingers in there often anyway. We just want to get these lined up nice. It's nice when we're working on that graph paper, because that graph paper, the lines from that graph paper showing through really help us to line these things up vertically. I've supplied a sample of that wall section with this video, but I recommend you redraw your own on fresh graph paper. Okay, now we want to make sure that that fits into place perfectly, and it does. The walls are still flexible enough at this point that if it's off a little bit one way or the other, it'll work. Okay, so that's how that's going to go. Now we've got our first roof truss piece, and we're going to glue it right behind our building like this, right behind the front like this. Now on the roof truss there's a front part and a back part, so notice that the rafter portion, the rafters themselves are actually resting against the building, against the front. A little balancing act required here. Main thing we want to do, we want to get that in position, and we want to put just enough glue in there so that we can sort of mark where the glue goes. So I'm just going to put just a speck of glue right there, and a speck of glue over here. Okay, I'm actually putting that glue against the front rather than against the rafter at this point. And what I'm doing is, see, so when I lay that down, I can now see where those specks of glue were. And I can add a little more glue, build it up to the right amount that I want there. Okay, now I hold this up into position again. Get it centered just right. Then I pick up my rafter section again, making sure that the rafter, not the cross piece, is towards the front, so it glues right up against that front. Then that tacks into place lightly. Then I'm going to very carefully remove this. I'm going to lay it down to dry. Okay. Now, since I have that rafter in the back, this no longer will lay flat. See, that front part is now down against the board, but the rafter is a little higher. So I take another rafter and I actually just slip it right under the edge like that. That way it stays nice and level. I can put some weight on it and let that dry. Okay, so that's going to work very well. So that's how our piece looks after we've got that first rafter on there. Okay, there you can see from the side how it looks and everything. It's nice and flush. You want to make sure this is done properly. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start adding some little trim pieces at the top. Well, this style of building that was popular at the time, they like to add little bits of trim. And that's one thing I like about having that little bit of the angled part of the roof exposed, is it makes for a nice area to add some trim pieces. So we're going to be adding some little trim pieces there. So here we're putting the glue. Now you'll notice we're putting these on the front of the rafter. We're not gluing this to the top of the rafter. We're gluing this to the front. So we just glue that carefully in place. See, that comes right up there, and we put that piece of wood behind it. So we want it to be flush because we're actually going to add some more pieces over this. We're going to build up some layers here of wood. And we want it so that that little part comes right up to the top. Very good. Okay. Now, while that's drying, we're going to do a little trim work on the side of the building. Our glue is set there, so our building's squared up pretty well. So we're going to put this little trim piece. This is a painted piece of 2x4. Works well for doing our trim work right there. And that's going to go right there at the end. See how that's going to fit in there? We have to taper it a bit at the top so that it matches the roof line. Then we want to mark it at the bottom. And we mark it by just cutting it, putting a mark there, cutting it. Then we go ahead and we actually glue it into place. And we want to put the glue along in here so it covers, touches a little bit of both surfaces there. This is just going to add a little bit of strength to the corner of our building. We don't have to worry about these buildings falling apart because they don't take a lot of abuse. But this does help hold it together a little better. Okay, so there we got the trim. Okay, so see how nicely that hides that corner? Okay. Very well done. Fits very nicely there. Okay. Okay. Of course, you can see that's bowing in a little bit. That's fine, that happens. We'll add more glue later. Now our trim pieces needed to be tapered at the top so they would fit just right. You have to fit one each place and see which way to make the taper. Now on this one I need to put a little notch. Okay, so I just put a little notch, and in that notch you'll have to eyeball how big that notch needs to be. But you'll see how that notch fits in. See, this one slides up with the wider area facing us. So there's going to be a notch there for the rafter at the top. And we just nick it here at the bottom so we know where to cut it. Then we set it aside and we actually make the cut. Then we'll have that piece ready to go into position. Again, we just run our glue along. This glue dries crystal clear, so little bits of it are hard to see, but we still want to be careful that we don't get a lot of extra on there. So that little trim piece fits right up in there like that. Fits in there perfect, just like that. So that's pretty much how that's going to look at this point. So we're making some good progress with this little building. Now what we have here is I'm pointing at that little trim piece at the top that we had added that was actually glued to the rafters, except I didn't glue it right at the very end. That was because I knew I was going to come later and cut that off. So I mark where that comes off at. And then I get hold and I press down in there a little bit. I don't try to cut all the way through at one time. I cut a bit and then I shave at an angle, like we did with the opening for the bottom of the door. Okay, and just work back and forth carefully on this. There you can see how I'm cutting at an angle instead of straight down. So then I cut straight down and that pops off at some point, and that makes it, see how that slope along there is now perfectly neat without any overhang? That's what we're trying for here. I'm doing exactly the same thing on the other side. Just working at it carefully, back and forth until that part pops off too. Very good. Okay. Now we're back to this part. Now looking at it from the other side, you'll be able to see how we're going to glue this next piece on. We cut it so it fits, and again it goes on the front of the rafter. And it goes up, and it actually goes right up to that very peak. Notice there's still a little notch behind there. In the original rafter we got a little bit of a notch there, and that's where the ridge board's going to fit in. So we just put this in and glue this little piece in place. To distribute the glue, I pick it up a little bit, take off the excess, and then move it around a little bit. Don't need an awful lot of glue to hold these things together. We want to make sure that that's flush with the side and at the top. We want a nice fit on this trim piece here. Okay, so that's going to give us a little decoration there. See, that part is going to match. Can you see there that it matches the rest of the 2x4s on the front? Now here we're going to add our trim piece for the front, just like we did for the back. So we want to measure the height. Since this isn't glued on, we can measure the height by just doing it this way. Makes it a little easier. On the rear we already had the wall in place. So that's just going to go in there like that. Okay. Add a little bit of glue. And we glue that in place, just like so. Okay. Make sure it's even at the top. We can always sand it later, but it's easier to do it now. Can you see over there on that far side that that actually protrudes up a little bit? Well, this piece is a 1/8 by 1/16 piece. The little corner that we're gluing into is 1/16 by 1/16, there where the siding is. And what we're going to do is, by gluing this on, I don't know how I can make this clear. When we glue these on, there's going to be room for planks to go along the front of the building that are going to fit up against this. Okay, so now we're looking at the top again. There on that peak, so we've got that end piece there, we've got it glued on now. And there you can see that opening. See that opening I was trying to talk about? See, there's a little gap there. That'll make room for planks to be put on. What we want to do now is we want to add some more decorative trim piece around the top. Okay, so for our little extra piece, we're going to use some of the same material we use for our rafters. We're going to use some 1/16 by 3/16, and it's just going to allow a little bit of trim work to protrude. Now if you want, you can pre-paint these things so that they're contrasting colors, or you can just go ahead and put them on, and that's what we're going to do here. So again, we just measure, we sand one in at an angle so it fits flush against the top of the front there, and just lay it in place. I'm trying to do this so you can see what I'm doing. Very good, and I'm just marking that at an angle right there into the wood. Okay, see how I cut through there? Okay, now that should leave that about the same. We want to cut another piece that's going to fit right up along over there. So once we get those two pieces cut, well, it's just a question of gluing them in place. Again, we want it to be flush with the back, because our roof is going to go in there. This is actually going to help hide our roof joint there with the front. And it's going to provide that little bit of ornamental trim that we're so used to seeing on Victorian era buildings. Just a little bit of fancy trim work. You can get real carried away with these little pieces you keep adding on, and that's how they did it. They didn't use fancy machine work a lot of the times. They just kept adding different planks of wood on, you know. If they were in a big city, they might have some ornamental scroll work, but for places out in the backwoods, they still like to have a little decorative detail, but they just build it out of commonly available materials instead of something fancy. Okay, so there we got the glue on. We're ready to put this second piece on. And very good. Just want to make sure that it fits in there. Takes quite a bit of fiddling to get all these things just right all the time. And once we get it on there, of course, we want to set it down. We want to let it dry. So there, you can see our little trim piece there, and there on the back, there's room there. There's our original rafter, and then our roofing materials will go right over it like that. See, that'll lay, our roof beams will lay right on there, right up against that. Okay, now we want to add some trim piece over here on our sides. On both sides, we want to add some trim. Bring right out to the end there. So we just cut a piece that fits. Again, using that same material that we use for our rafters. Just test fit it, see how it's going to look. I want to make sure that it's squared up. Okay. And we have it overhanging. See, it overhangs a bit. Now that amount that it overhangs is pretty much up to your personal taste. Everybody has a different idea of how much this overhang should be. And then we just glue these in place. Like everything else here, all this is very straightforward, very easy to do. Just requires a bunch of little steps in order to get it to look just the way you want it to. And we're just wanting to make sure we got that squared up. And we go over, of course, and we do exactly the same thing on the other side. We cut it and trim it and put that piece in place over on the other side. Okay. And again, the amount of the overhang on these pieces, the part that sticks out, you can make it flush if you want. I like them to stick out a little bit. Lots of different ways to add ornamentation to the front. Now I want to make sure that joint's clear. See, there I didn't quite get it down, so I need to push it all the way down. Don't want to leave any gaps in here. These pieces would fit close together in real life. So we want to make sure they fit together well on our model too. Okay, so that's how that cap piece on the front's going to look. Looks pretty nice. Now you can take some of your siding material. You might want to actually take a piece of that is a scale 1 foot. If you add additional trim over the top, you can just keep adding layers. See, if you add another layer on there, it's another nice piece of trim work. Just build layers, add layers up as much as you want. Along in here's where our sign's going to be. Okay, now we're all ready to start adding our front siding. Now for our front siding here, what I use is 1/8 by 1/16, the same thing we use for our studs. It's just a convenient size to work with, and using the smaller vertical boards along the front, and you'll notice these are not painted. I'm going to do the painting after the siding is in place. You can paint it beforehand if you want, or you can paint it afterwards. At the point I was really building this, I wasn't quite sure whether I was going to have a white siding on a white front on the building or exactly what kind of color, so I was just working on it. This also happens to fit right up against the windows very fine, another good reason for using the 1/8 by 1/16. It fits right in there fine, very easily done. Now we want to add a piece alongside the other sides of the window. So again, we just put our glue right along those studs, right along that area next to the door. Just bring that right on down. Okay. And we'll glue the one for the other side at the same time. Now by putting the two outside pieces on first, and then putting these two pieces that are there by the door, that will mean that the pieces that we put on above the windows, we'll have to fit those into place. So if any of those, if it's too tight, we'll need to taper one of those pieces later. But we don't want to work straight from the sides. We want to establish, since these are strong vertical lines and pieces that are very important, we want to put these trim pieces on first. Of course, I've got them trimmed at the top so they fit in a position. Didn't feel any need to sit here and let you watch me cut the wood and everything. I want to make sure we get those lined up right, just right with the inside of the door. Our door casting is going to fit right into that area there. And as always, on most of the steps here, I take the time to really let these dry. I don't show that in the video, of course, but after I put pieces on, I'll do something else. I'll work on another section while the thing's dry. Got to get those just lined up just right. Sometimes it can be a little tricky to do. And just may need to put a little weight on that to hold it down. Okay, now we're going to work on these vertical pieces that are in between. And we're going to be able to cover quite a bit of ground here in a hurry, so I can glue more than just one piece at a time. Okay, so I just put the glue in place. And I just reach over and drop one of my vertical pieces in. I've got my vertical pieces pre-cut so that they're the proper length, of course. And those just drop in and you just build them up. Now notice I'm leaving a little bit of a gap between them. I'm not really pushing them flush up against each other. The reason I'm leaving that little tiny bit of gap is it helps to show that they're individual pieces of wood. And what actually happens with wood when it's new is it's filled with a lot of moisture. But as wood ages, that moisture disappears. The wood dries out, and when it dries out, it actually shrinks. So while there might not be gaps between these boards at the time the building was built, there would be minor gaps as time went on. And notice this piece that I'm putting in here is trimmed at an angle at the top, so it fits right against that trim work at the top. There you can see we got a little bit of a gap, so what I want to do is I want to just even that out. Rather than leave one big gap there, I'm just going to go back and use something thin, like my razor blade or the X-Acto blade, and just space things out just a little bit. Just to put a little bit of gap in between all these different pieces here. don't want any one piece to have a huge amount of gap. It doesn't have to be perfectly even, because when they built things back at this time, there's generally a gold boom going on, and they were more interested in getting it done quickly, and finding anybody who'd take the time to build something for you was always something to do, so they might not be the best carpenter. So while we try to follow general good carpentry principles in building our structure, we don't become a slave to it. We don't become addicted to it. Okay, since we put it on that side, we're just going to go ahead. We're going to do the same thing along here in the area above the door. Just put our glue in. After you've used Elmer's glue for a while, you learn how much area you can work on at a time before it sets up, before it dries. And I find, since I've got my pieces already cut, I can work on an area like this pretty well. Of course, I cut my pieces by trying and fitting these before gluing them. And again, not pushing them right against each other, but leaving a little bit of a gap. Trying to center that piece so it's right there at the peak. And we just continue adding the pieces, spacing them out, getting them just the way we like them. A lot of people, when they would build old structures like this, would put the battens across these individual boards and often use those battens in contrasting color. That's one thing that we could do here. We could paint the whole front of the building one particular color, like red, and then put white battens right across between these individual planks. And we just continue gluing these pieces into place. I've actually made quite a bit of progress on the building at this point. It's always fun when you get the basic building framework together for the first time. It's always fun when you get the details on here. This is the type area when you're working on the front of the building like this, that any little extra details that you can think of to add will just make it nice. Builders back then didn't have an awful lot of fancy materials to work with, but they found they could do wonders with just taking different blocks of wood, taking a block of wood maybe a foot long and nailing it onto one of these upright beams, and then putting a block 6 inches long, nailing that on the front of it, centering it up and down. I can remember going around Silverton, Colorado, and I spent a lot of time just looking at the false fronts there very carefully to see how they were done. And while some of it was done using fancy scroll work, much of it was done with just using blocks of wood, and these would often be blocks of wood that were just leftover pieces of wood at the end of actually building the building itself. So lots of different ways of utilizing things. Okay, so there's our top of our front. Now we're just going to go along across the bottom, and we're going to apply some little pieces across the bottom. Again, these I have all these pre-cut. So they go into place very quickly. One thing you can do when putting things across the bottom here is occasionally have one of these actually be missing, because they would get kicked and worn as time went on. So that would be an easy little thing to add if you wanted to do that. And we want to make sure that we're even across the bottom, because that's going to be resting against a porch. We're going to have a porch for the front of this one. But this could be a little building that was on a platform of some sort, either like a freight platform or a city block where the sidewalks were all built already. Lots of different uses for a little building like this. It's a small structure, but the proportions of it are something that I find very pleasing. So hopefully you'll find this a pleasing design as well too. Lots of different variations can be built with just this simple basic design. A lot of people today, when they look at these older buildings, they think they're pretty small, and this is a small building at 10 feet wide and about 20 feet long. It's definitely a small building. But if you've ever gone to any place where there's actually ghost towns, you're going to find that, of course, there are large buildings, but so many of the buildings are actually quite small. At Knott's Berry Farm in California, some of the buildings there are literally only 8 feet by 8 feet, and they used to have a little ticket station that they had brought in from a ghost town that was about 4 feet wide and about 6 feet deep. It was just barely big enough for somebody to stand in there, but it was a freestanding building. Of course, a multitude of small buildings will make your layout look larger than having just one or two very large buildings. So I like to go for small buildings, and you can have a lot of variety in something like this. You can use this as a standard shape or a great many things. Okay, here you can see I've got my white paint that I use, my Tester's white paint, and I've got the lids of some of the light brown and the light gray that I used for matching up the window castings earlier. And I'm just adding a little bit of brown into the white paint. So it's still going to look white. It's going to have a little bit of brown in it. And I'm just going to paint some of these boards, not all the way across, but I don't want to have a zebra pattern on these boards, of course. But I'm just going to paint these boards individually with a little bit different mixture of white on certain boards and a little bit different mixture of brown. And since these boards are actually separated a little bit, I can do this pretty carefully. Now a painter, when he would be painting a building like this, if you get some of the paint onto the adjacent board, that's going to be okay too, because it's still essentially a white board. And by just painting these boards differently with very slight variations in the color, rather than just having it all be stark white all the way across. Now here you can see I'm adding a little bit of the gray. By having these very minor variations, it adds an awful lot in depth and texture to the particular structure that you're working with. Just one of those little techniques that we use. I haven't roughed up the wood or anything at this point. I'm just putting the paint on there right on the stained wood. I did stain this, of course, with my alcohol dyes. And I'm just getting, like, see, I'm going to eventually have this all completely covered. This whole front is going to be completely covered. And we just continue on with this, just adding our paints and everything. Just going to let this run along here, and as I'm doing this, rather than me just rambling on about things, let me just bring up a little bit of our background music here. Okay, now so you can see along through here that I'm also painting that arched area up at the top. Want to make sure we get all of our front painted. And again, you can tell by looking at it here that it's not a sloppy painting job. I always paint in the direction of the wood grain. But I'm just wanting to get everything covered here with a light coat of paint. If you want a brand new building, you can certainly paint the colors very strong here and get a very good coating, but the effect that I'm after is that of an old worn building where the weather's had a lot of effect upon it. And just brushing along. I use these little throwaway paintbrushes. I buy these, this is a pretty stiff little brush, but I buy brushes. When I buy brushes, I buy them bundles at a time. I buy real cheap brushes. I rarely buy expensive brushes. You read over and over the value of expensive brushes, and I just don't need expensive brushes. I like pretty stiff brushes, and these are very cheap. I actually buy these in packages from Dick Blick. You can find Dick Blick online at dickblick.com, and they have an assortment here of these stiff brushes that probably has 144 brushes in it, I think. And I just use them for all kinds of different things. I use them for applying epoxy. I use them for painting for things like this. They're great for backdrop painting. They come in a variety of sizes. There's a bunch of small ones, a bunch of big ones, and I find I have to buy new paintbrushes every couple of years. Okay, well there we're getting pretty much the effect that we want to have to start with. Okay, I may want to pick out one board here and there and just highlight it to bring it out. See how that just adding just almost straight white there really brings that out. Do that to a few boards. You don't want to get carried away. Again, we're not trying for a zebra stripe here. We're just trying to get some obvious variety in the boards. Just do this to the amount that you want, and when you feel you've done enough of this, well, just stop and go on to something else. This is the part of your model that people are going to see the most, so you want to spend whatever time is needed in order to do it correctly. Painting around the windows and everything. My windows are still, they pop right out, obviously. And by popping them out, then I can get right in there in that framework around there and get a really good paint job on there as well. So it looks, should look pretty good. That's what we're after here. And trying to pork that window out. Come out pretty easy so that I can go ahead and do this. Now I'm going to leave the inside of the building in its stained wood. Now if you get any white paint on the inside of the building, that's fine. Be a lot of different kind of stains that built up on the inside of these buildings, and sometimes when people would be painting white paint on the outside, they'd get a little bit of it slopped in on the inside. Okay, we'll just listen to some more music here while I paint. Now these are all open areas here, and in these open areas like this is where we're going to, where it's exposed to the weather, we want to have paint on there to protect it. Just making sure we get all these areas covered. Okay. Now that's how it looks. You see the variation in the color there. You can see the little bit of gaps, how everything sticks through, and that just automatically, by doing it that way, you automatically get a fairly old look to start with. A very effective and easy way of doing this. Now, what I want to do is, once I've let this paint thoroughly dry, I then take the sharp part of my X-Acto knife, and I'm not going to rough this wood up and gouge it very much on the front, but I am going to, while following the grain of the wood, I am going to scrape through that outer layer of paint and down into the wood underneath a little bit. I don't want to weather this extremely weathered. I just want to do it just enough to add a little more variety and a little more texture. These little threads that are on there, we'll get those off with an emery board. Emery board or a piece of sandpaper makes a quick job of getting rid of those little threads. Just like that. But our wood this way has a little bit of the grain showing through. I'm not trying for any specific grain, just trying to scrape it through. And there wouldn't be a lot of knot holes on the front of buildings like this. They would save their better pieces of wood to put on the front where people would notice it the most. A lot of these buildings would be repainted on the front on a regular basis so that they looked nice, but often they were just neglected. Store owners today are the same way. They recognized it's good to paint the building in order to protect the building itself, but there's a tremendous amount of time invested in painting, plus the cost of the materials, so they're often neglected. You see a lot of neglect as you drive around. Wherever you live, you'll find buildings that are neglected. And it was certainly even more so back when it was harder to get materials and labor was scarce. Often when a store owner would have his building painted, he wouldn't be using professional painters, but he would just be using whoever he could get to do it. A lot of time it was just a miner who had run out of money, was in town building up a grub stake. So we just continued to work at this a little bit and clean it up a bit. Now I'm going to put some nail holes across here, and I just use my emery board as a straight edge with my Ponce wheel, and I just run it back and forth, and this puts a lot of nail holes in there in a hurry. It's hard to see here until we add the stain, but put these nail holes at the top, put them down at the bottom, put a row, try to center it right through the middle. A lot of this area is going to be covered by a sign later, but I like to put those nail holes in. Got to be very careful working down on small pieces of wood like this. Very careful. Might need to actually use a drill bit or a straight pin or something like that to poke the holes in, rather than using a Ponce wheel. Very easy to knock these pieces loose. Of course, you can always just glue them back on if they do get knocked loose. There you can see those, very faintly you can see those right across there. Now here, right up along the eave, I want to add some nail holes, and I'm using a small drill. Lots of different ways of adding the nail holes, but it's something I think adds an awful lot to the finished look of the building. And again, as we've talked about before, some people like having nail holes. Some people don't like having them, but I personally do. Back then, they didn't use a lot of galvanized nails. They would use nails that were just made out of steel, and it would rust. And you'd actually get rust stains running down from these nail holes. Quite frequently, the rust would build up and just run down the front of the building. It's a little detail that you can add if you want to do that. And after you've done that, just come back with the emery board and dress it up and get it as nice looking as you can. It's easier to do it now than when it's assembled. And I just come with my stain, and again I'm trying to hit just right where those nail holes are, rather than staining the whole front of the building with one big coat. Trying to go right across where the nails are. Now right now that stripe is pretty bold and pronounced, but once these stains have dried, this stripe that's right across there is not going to be that noticeable. It's going to be very much subdued. And one right across the middle there. Right now we get sort of a zebra stripe effect. Like I say, that's going to disappear once these actually set up. And maybe some nail holes right there. Put some nail holes right along there, where they would have nailed that trim piece over the front of the framework. And alongside the windows and door castings, of course, on both sides. And when I add the stain here, I pretty much have to put it along the whole thing. But that'll be fine too. And a little bit of extra stain around the bottom. Okay. Okay, so that's pretty much how it's going to be. Put a little stain on these pieces that are going to be hanging down. These are the rafters that protrude through. The angle you cut your end of your rafters at is pretty much up to you. Here I've got them just square planks of wood, but frequently they would be cut so that they would follow the vertical size and direction of the vertical frames of the building. I'm just going around, just touching up all the areas there that need a little bit of a stain. Now in a video like this, there's going to be times where some of these sequences I show are longer than you might feel are necessary, but you just never know where to cut it or not. Now I'm going to go, I've put my window castings in. I haven't scored my window castings here. These are still in pretty good shape. But I am going back and I'm adding a little bit of that same brown shoe dye to the painted window castings. And since the plastic castings are painted white, and I painted the wood part of the front of the building white, this keeps the colors uniform. They're not going to be exactly the same, of course, but they're going to be very, very close. Okay. Just looking for any areas that might need touching up. Well, now we're at the point to where we're going to be thinking in terms of assembling this building. Now we have a little lip here. See, that hangs over a little tiny bit, and that's going to fit right into that notch there. So this is going to just fit right in there. When we glue this in place, that's going to fit right in there. We got that trim work that we put on there. And see, we don't have any big gaps or anything. And it overlaps a little bit there to give us a little added strength. Okay, so we're at that point to where it's time to go ahead and assemble the building. Just going to put a little bit of glue along here on each side. It's always exciting when you get to this point because you're going to be, our four walls are going to be glued together. And once our four walls are glued together, then we can start giving attention to other parts of the building, such as the roof. Well, this particular tape is finishing up this DVD. So at this time, we're just going to fade out here and just finish this up and let a little bit of Zydeco music finish out this segment.